If you move, they will see you. The words did not belong to anyone she could see, not at first, and yet they seemed to settle directly against the back of Eliza Whitmore's neck as she stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding a silver tray that had grown heavier by the minute, her fingers tightening just slightly beneath the polished surface as laughter rose and fell around her like something she was never meant to be part of, and the chandeliers above burned with a steady golden brilliance that turned every polished floor tile into a mirror, reflecting gowns, jewels, and faces that all looked certain of where they belonged, unlike hers, which remained lowered, carefully angled away from notice, because she had learned early that being unseen was safer than being corrected. And tonight, of all nights, correction would not come quietly, not in a room where 12 young women stood in a perfect arc near the center, each one dressed in silk that whispered when they shifted their weight, each one positioned as if the future had already chosen them. And perhaps it had, because no one looked toward the edges where she stood, not even her own family, who passed her twice without acknowledgement, as if she were part of the furniture that had been polished and arranged hours before the guests arrived. And it might have remained that way. It should have remained that way, except for the moment the music faltered, not fully stopping but slipping just enough for those trained to notice such things to feel it in their chest before they heard it in their ears. And then the doors opened, not dramatically, not with force, but with a precision that drew attention without demanding it. And Duke Alexander Blackwood entered as though he had always been there, and the room had simply rearranged itself to accommodate his presence, his coat dark, his posture exact, his expression composed in a way that made every other man seem slightly unfinished by comparison, and he did not look at the line of carefully presented women immediately, which was the first deviation from expectation, but instead moved forward at a measured pace, the sound of his shoes against marble deliberate, unhurried, as if time itself adjusted to match him. And Eliza did not look up, not at first, because it was not her place, because it had never been her place, and yet she felt it. Not quite a gaze, something colder, something more precise, like the awareness of being counted without being acknowledged, and her grip shifted, just slightly, enough for the edge of one glass to tilt against another, and that was all it took. A single small misalignment, a soft, fragile collision, the kind that would go unnoticed in any other room. But not this one, not tonight, and the glass slipped, not dramatically, not with a crash that demanded attention, but with a quiet, irreversible slide that ended in a sharp, contained shatter against the marble floor, champagne spreading in a thin, golden arc that caught the chandelier light and held it there, frozen for half a second too long, and everything around her seemed to pause, not fully stopping, but slowing in a way that made each movement distinct, each breath visible, and she bent immediately, instinct overriding thought, reaching for the broken pieces before anyone could speak, before anyone could turn, before the mistake could become hers in the way mistakes always became hers. And it was then that she saw them, not the faces, not yet, but the shoes, polished, black, unmoving, standing directly in the spill she had just created, not stepping back, not avoiding it, simply there, as if the moment had arranged itself beneath him. And she froze, hand hovering just inches above the fractured glass, aware of the silence forming, aware of the shift, aware that something had already begun to move that she did not yet understand. And for the first time that evening, she lifted her gaze just enough to see him looking directly at her, not past her, not through her, but at her. And it was not recognition, not exactly. It was something quieter, something sharper, and far more dangerous, because in a room designed to display perfection, he had stopped for the one person who was never meant to be seen, and nobody moved. No one bent to help her. That was the first thing Eliza noticed after the glass shattered, not the sound itself, not the thin line of champagne slipping between the marble seams, but the absence of movement around her, the careful stillness of people who had already decided the mistake did not belong to them. And she kept her hand suspended just above the broken pieces for half a second longer than necessary before lowering it, her fingers closing around the stem of the nearest glass with precise care, as if the act of cleaning it quickly enough might undo the moment entirely. But it did not, because the shoes in front of her had not moved, and when she shifted slightly to gather the larger shards, the hem of her sleeve brushed against the edge of his coat, And that was when the murmurs began, not loud, not obvious, but present, threading through the music that had resumed too quickly, too brightly, as though the orchestra had been instructed to cover something that should not be seen. And Eliza felt the weight of it, the attention turning. Not fully, not yet, but enough. And she lowered her gaze again, because that was what she had always done, because that was how one survived rooms like this, by becoming smaller than the mistake, smaller than the moment, smaller than the space one occupied. But the space did not shrink with her this time. It held, it resisted, and when she reached for the final piece of glass, a hand appeared in her periphery, not touching her, not interfering, simply there, close enough that she could see the faint line of a scar across the knuckle of his index finger, and she paused, not because she chose to, but because her body did it for her. And in that pause, something shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that changed the direction of a room without anyone announcing it. And she became aware, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he was still looking at her, not the tray, not the spill, not the broken glass, but her. And it was not curiosity, not the shallow interest of a man observing something unusual. It was assessment, quiet, exacting, and entirely unhidden. And that was what unsettled her, not the attention itself, but the fact that it was not disguised, not softened, not explained away by politeness. And she straightened slowly, the tray balanced again against her palm, the remaining glasses steady, though her fingers had tightened just enough to leave faint impressions against the silver edge, and she took a small step back, intending to remove herself from his path, to return to the perimeter where she belonged. But the step did not complete, because another hand, not his, closed around her wrist from behind, firm enough to redirect her without causing a scene, and she did not turn immediately. Because she knew that grip, she had known it for years, the precise pressure of someone correcting a misstep before it became visible, and when she did turn, it was only slightly, enough to see her aunt's face angled toward her with a smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile that was meant for the room, not for her. Careful, her aunt said softly, the words shaped like concern, but carrying something sharper beneath it. You will make a spectacle of yourself. And Eliza inclined her head, a small acknowledgement, because there was nothing else she could offer, no defense that would not worsen the moment, and the grip on her wrist tightened just enough to guide her backward, out of the Duke's immediate space, out of the line of sight that had settled on her too long. And she allowed it, because resisting would draw more attention, because yielding was easier, because yielding was what she had always done. But she felt it again, the resistance in the room, the way the space did not close behind her as it should have, the way the distance between her and the Duke did not resolve into something ordinary. And she did not look at him, not directly, but she was aware of him in the way one is aware of a door left open in a quiet house, a presence that alters the air without making a sound. And the orchestra played on, the strings rising, the rhythm returning, but it no longer fit the room the same way. Not quite, not fully, because something had been interrupted, something had been noticed, and as her aunt drew her further toward the edge, toward the shadows where she could be absorbed again, there came a voice, not loud, not raised, but precise enough to cut cleanly through the music without competing with it, a single word, delivered without emphasis and yet impossible to ignore. Stay. And the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not chaotic, but absolute, as if the instruction had reached not only her, but the space itself, because the hand on her wrist stopped, the movement halted, the distance froze in place, and Eliza felt it before she understood it, the command settling into her bones. And for the first time that evening, she did not lower her head. She did not step back. She did not disappear. She remained exactly where she was, caught between being removed and being seen, between the world that had always defined her and something that had just, without warning, begun to shift, and nobody in the ballroom seemed quite certain what would happen next. The word did not echo, yet it lingered, suspended in the air like a held breath that no one dared release. And Eliza felt the hand on her wrist hesitate, not loosening, not tightening, simply pausing in a way that suggested uncertainty had entered a space where it did not belong. And her aunt's fingers remained exactly where they were, firm and composed, but no longer certain of their direction. And that was the first fracture. not in sound, not in movement, but in authority, subtle enough that it could have been missed by anyone not standing inside it. And Eliza became aware of her own posture in a way she had never been before. The angle of her shoulders, the balance of the tray in her hand, the exact position of her feet against the marble floor, as if the entire room had narrowed to the few inches of space she occupied, and she did not move, not because she had decided not to, but because the command had settled into her with a clarity that left no room for decision. And across from her, Duke Alexander Blackwood remained exactly as he had been, one step inside the spill of champagne that had already begun to dry at the edges, his gaze steady, unhurried, as though he were waiting for something that had not yet been offered. And the music continued, but it no longer held the room together. It floated above it, disconnected, as conversations faltered and resumed in uneven rhythms. And one of the young women near the center of the floor let out a soft laugh that arrived half a second too late, her fan lifting to conceal a smile that did not quite settle. And Eliza's aunt inclined her head slightly, the gesture small but deliberate, her voice lowering just enough to remain private while still carrying the weight of instruction. "Your Grace," she said, without turning fully toward him, "there has been a minor accident." And the word accident seemed to stretch, to cover more than the broken glass, more than the spilled champagne, more than the presence of a girl who had no place in the center of such attention. And Eliza felt the pressure on her wrist shift again, not pulling her away this time, but holding her in place as if her aunt had not yet decided which direction would cause less damage. And for a moment, nothing happened, not visibly, not in a way that could be named, but the stillness deepened, and then the Duke moved, not forward, not closer, but a slight adjustment of weight, the kind that changed the angle of his shoulders by an inch, and yet the effect was immediate, because the space between them seemed to align, to sharpen, as though the room itself had recognized a line that had not been there before. And his voice, when it came, was quiet enough to remain within the circle that had formed around them, but clear enough that there was no mistaking its direction. "Let her go," he said, and it was not a request, not softened, not framed in courtesy, simply stated, as though the outcome had already been decided. And Eliza felt it before she saw it, the shift in her aunt's grip, the momentary tightening that came not from resistance but from calculation. And then, slowly, carefully, her wrist was released, not dropped, not pushed away, but relinquished in a way that preserved dignity while conceding ground. And Eliza's arm remained where it was, suspended for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, before lowering to her side, the tray still balanced, the glasses unbroken, her fingers steady in a way that surprised even her. And she did not step back, though every instinct she had ever learned urged her to do so. She did not retreat into the edge of the room where she could be absorbed and forgotten. Instead, she stood, exactly where she had been told to remain. And that was the second fracture, more visible now, more difficult to ignore, because it was not only the Duke who had acted, it was her, however small the action might have been. And the line of young women near the center had begun to shift, their arrangement no longer perfect, no longer certain, one of them turning slightly to look, another lowering her fan just enough to reveal the direction of her attention. And the murmur that followed was softer than before, but more focused, threading through the music in a way that could not be dismissed as coincidence. And Eliza became aware of the distance between herself and the Duke, not measured in steps, but in expectation, in the unspoken understanding of where she should be and where she was not. And he closed that distance, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the same measured pace that had carried him into the room, each step deliberate, each movement contained, until he stood close enough that she could see the precise line of his collar, the faint crease at the edge of his sleeve, the detail of a man who did not waste motion. And he stopped, not reaching for her, not touching the tray, simply standing within her space in a way that made it impossible to pretend she was still invisible. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with the weight of everything that had already shifted and everything that had not yet been said. And somewhere near the entrance, beyond the line of columns and the heavy drapes, footsteps sounded against stone, distant but approaching, steady, unmistakable. And Eliza felt it then, the next movement forming, not in her, not in him, but in the room itself, gathering just beyond the edge of what anyone could control, and she did not move. The footsteps did not belong to a servant. That much was clear before the figure even appeared, because servants learn to move around a room like this without sound, without presence, without consequence, but these steps carried weight, measured, unhurried, each one landing with the quiet authority of someone who expected the space to make room before they arrived, and the effect rippled outward before the man himself crossed the threshold. Conversations thinning, shoulders adjusting, attention redirecting in small, controlled shifts that revealed more than any announcement could, and Eliza felt it in the way the air changed, tightening slightly, as if the ballroom had drawn a breath it had not yet decided to release. And beside her, Duke Alexander Blackwood did not turn immediately, which was itself a statement, because everyone else did. Every gaze angled toward the entrance where a tall figure now stood framed between the columns, his coat lighter, his expression composed in a way that suggested familiarity with the room, not ownership, but something close enough to it to matter, and Eliza did not know his name, but she recognized the type, the kind of man whose arrival required acknowledgement, whose presence carried expectations that did not need to be spoken, and her aunt moved first, stepping forward with a precision that had been practiced over years, her smile returning, polished, controlled, her voice rising just enough to bridge the distance. "Lord Harrington," she said, as though nothing had shifted, as though the room had not already begun to tilt, and the name settled into the space with quiet recognition, drawing nods, subtle inclinations of heads, the kind of response that confirmed his place without elevating it beyond what was appropriate. And still, the Duke did not move, not toward him, not away, not even a turn of the head. And that was when the tension sharpened, because in a room governed by hierarchy, acknowledgement was currency, and withholding it was never accidental, and Eliza stood within that absence, acutely aware of her own position in a structure she did not control. The tray still balanced in her hand, though the weight had shifted, though her fingers had begun to register the strain she had been holding at bay, and she adjusted her grip by a fraction of an inch, the movement small, controlled, but it was enough to draw a flicker of attention from someone standing just beyond the Duke's shoulder, enough to remind her that she was still visible, still exposed, still standing in a place she should have already vacated, and her instinct returned, sharp and immediate, to step back, to retreat, to dissolve into the edges where she could no longer disrupt the balance of the room, and her foot moved, just slightly, heel lifting from the marble. The beginning of a motion she had repeated countless times before, and it would have completed, it should have completed, except the Duke moved at the same moment, not reaching for her, not touching her, but stepping forward just enough to occupy the space she would have stepped into, closing the path without blocking it outright. A subtle redirection that required no force, no contact, only presence, and her foot settled back into place, the motion undone before it could be seen as anything more than a shift in balance. And the effect was immediate, a freeze that extended beyond her. Because the nearest figures registered it, the alignment of bodies, the narrowing of space, the unspoken decision that had just been made without words, and Lord Harrington's gaze, which had been sweeping the room with practiced ease, paused, not on the Duke, not immediately, but on the point where the Duke stood too close to a girl who did not belong in that proximity, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw comment, but enough to mark the moment, and he stepped forward, closing the distance from the entrance with the same measured pace, his attention now fixed, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried easily, not raised, but placed. "Your Grace," he said, inclining his head just enough to acknowledge rank without conceding more than necessary, and the title hung there, waiting for a response that did not come, not immediately, and the silence that followed stretched, not long, but long enough to be noticed, long enough to shift the weight of expectation from one man to the other, and Eliza felt herself at the center of something she did not understand, not fully, but enough to recognize its danger, not in action, not in threat, but in consequence, because rooms like this did not forget deviations, they corrected them, they absorbed them, or they erased them, and she stood between those outcomes, held in place by a decision that had not yet been explained. And then, at last, the Duke turned his head, not fully, not with urgency, just enough to acknowledge the presence that had entered, his gaze moving past Harrington rather than settling on him, as though the man were part of the room rather than its focus. And when he spoke, it was not to the one who had addressed him, but to her, the words quiet, precise, cutting through the layered tension without raising their volume. "You will remain," he said, and it was not a suggestion, not a courtesy, but a placement, a declaration of position that overrode the one she had been given since birth, and the effect was immediate, not in sound, but in stillness, because every movement in the room seemed to pause, to recalibrate around that single shift. And Eliza felt it, the weight of it, the impossible distance between who she had been a moment ago and who she was being forced to become, not by her own choice, not by her own voice, but by the quiet certainty of a man who had decided she would not step back again. And this time, when the room froze, it did not feel like an accident. No one spoke immediately after the words settled, not because they had not heard them, but because they had. And that was the problem, because the room understood what had just been altered even if no one chose to acknowledge it aloud. And Eliza felt it in the way the air pressed closer, the way the space around her no longer belonged entirely to her, and she became acutely aware of her hands, of the tray still balanced against her palm, of the faint tremor she had been holding back now, threatening to surface as the silence stretched, and she adjusted her grip again, a small movement, controlled, but this time it did not go unnoticed, because Lord Harrington's gaze dropped to it, then lifted back to her face with a precision that felt almost intrusive, as though he were measuring something that had not been meant for him to see. And he stepped closer, not directly into her space, but near enough that the line between them became part of the same conversation, his posture relaxed, his expression composed in that careful way that suggested interest without investment. And when he spoke, it was not to her, not yet, but to the Duke, though his eyes did not fully leave her. "I was not aware," he said, each word placed with deliberate ease, "that the evening included additional introductions." And the pause before the final phrase was slight, almost courteous, but it carried the weight of implication, the kind that allowed the room to interpret without forcing a response. And Eliza felt the shift again, the subtle tightening of attention, the way the women near the center adjusted their positions, their shoulders angling, their smiles returning just enough to mask the calculation behind them. And her aunt stepped forward once more, reclaiming space that had begun to slip from her control, her voice smooth, practiced. "My niece is not part of the presentation," she said, the words clear, precise, designed to restore order, to correct the narrative before it could settle into something more permanent. And Eliza felt the familiar pull of that identity, the one that reduced her to something manageable, something that could be explained and dismissed within the same breath. And for a moment, it almost worked, almost returned the room to its previous alignment. But the Duke did not acknowledge the correction, did not shift his stance, did not offer the expected adjustment that would have allowed the structure to hold. And instead, he reached out, not abruptly, not with force, but with a controlled, deliberate motion that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. His hand closing around the edge of the tray she still held, steadying it before it could tilt under the pressure she had not realized she was applying. And the contact was brief, precise, the kind that could be dismissed as practical if it had not been witnessed by a room already watching too closely. And Eliza felt the warmth of it linger for a fraction of a second longer than the touch itself, her breath catching not in surprise, but in recognition of what it meant, not the gesture, but the visibility of it, and the tray still beneath his hand, the glasses no longer trembling, the small, fragile instability brought under control in a way that felt both grounding and exposing at the same time. And when he released it, his fingers withdrawing without hesitation, the space he left behind did not close. It held, marked now by something that had been seen and could not be unseen. And Lord Harrington's expression shifted again, this time more openly. Not displeasure, not quite, but interest sharpened into something more deliberate. And he took another step forward, closing the distance further, positioning himself just slightly to the side, as though aligning with the Duke rather than opposing him. Though the effect was anything but neutral, then perhaps, he said, his tone still even, still controlled. We are all learning something new this evening. And the room responded, not with words, but with the subtle tightening of attention, the collective awareness that the boundaries had moved and no one had yet decided how far they would go. And Eliza stood within that shift, her body still, her posture unchanged, though everything inside her had begun to recalibrate, because she understood now, not fully, but enough, that this was no longer about a mistake, no longer about a broken glass or a misplaced step. It was about position, about who was allowed to stand where and who decided it, and the decision had been taken out of her hands without her consent, placed instead in the quiet authority of a man who had not explained himself and did not intend to. And her aunt's hand returned, this time not to her wrist, but hovering just behind her elbow, close enough to guide, not yet touching, waiting for the moment when intervention could be justified without appearing desperate. And Eliza felt it there, the familiar pressure of expectation, the unspoken command to correct the situation before it hardened into something irreversible. And her foot shifted again, the smallest movement, the beginning of a retreat that would restore the balance everyone understood. And for a fraction of a second, it seemed possible, that she could still step back, still disappear, still become what she had always been. But the Duke moved at the same time, not blocking her, not restraining her, but stepping closer once more, the distance between them narrowing to something that left no room for ambiguity, his presence filling the space she had intended to vacate. And her movement stopped before it could complete, held in place not by force, but by the impossibility of moving through him without acknowledging what he had already declared. And the room stilled again, not fully, not entirely, but enough that the next breath felt shared, enough that the next movement would not belong to her alone. And in that suspended moment, with every eye drawn toward a place that had never been meant to hold attention, Eliza Whitmore stood exactly where she had been told to remain, and for the first time in her life, the choice to move or to stay no longer felt like hers at all. The space between them did not close. It tightened, like a thread drawn slowly through fabric until the tension held everything in place. And Eliza felt it in the way her breath no longer moved freely, in the way the tray in her hand seemed to anchor her to the exact spot where she stood, because stepping away was no longer a simple act of retreat. It would be a statement now, a refusal or a surrender, and neither belonged to her to decide. Not with the Duke standing so close that the edge of his coat nearly brushed her sleeve again. And across from them, Lord Harrington shifted his weight, not retreating, not advancing, but adjusting in a way that suggested he had recognized the line being drawn and had chosen, at least for now, to stand just outside it, observing rather than interrupting. And that choice carried its own kind of pressure, because the room followed it, attention settling into a careful balance that could tip with the smallest movement. And Eliza's aunt did not wait for that movement to come from elsewhere. She stepped forward again, this time closing the distance fully, her hand no longer hovering, but landing lightly against Eliza's arm, the contact controlled, deliberate, her fingers pressing just enough to guide without appearing forceful. And her voice, when it came, was softer than before, lowered to a tone that suggested intimacy while carrying a command meant only for one person. You have done enough, she said, each word precise, each one placed as though it might restore the order that had begun to slip. Leave the tray. And Eliza felt the instruction settle into her. Familiar, practiced, the path laid out as it had always been. Simple, clear, safe. And for a moment, her fingers loosened. Just slightly, the weight of the silver edge shifting against her palm as if the tray itself were responding to the permission to be released. And it would have fallen, not dramatically, not with a crash, but with a quiet inevitability that would have ended her presence in the center of the room, reduced her again to the role she had always occupied. Except the Duke moved again, not abruptly, not in a way that could be called interruption, but with a precision that intercepted the motion before it completed, his hand returning to the tray, not taking it, not removing it from her, but steadying it once more, holding it exactly where it had been before her fingers loosened. And the effect was immediate. The motion halted, the outcome reversed before it could be seen. and Eliza felt the correction as clearly as she had felt the command earlier, not imposed, not explained, simply there, undeniable. And her fingers tightened again, not because she chose to, but because the option to let go had been quietly removed, and her aunt's hand stilled against her arm, the pressure no longer guiding, now measuring, recalibrating, as though the calculation had changed and she had not yet decided how to respond. And Lord Harrington's gaze flickered between them, not missing the movement, not missing the control that had been asserted without raising a voice, and the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something sharper, something that suggested recognition of a game that had just become more interesting than expected. And he took another step, this time not toward the Duke, but slightly to the side, aligning himself with the arc of the room in a way that placed him within the audience rather than the exchange. And that repositioning mattered, because it left the space between Eliza and the Duke unchallenged, unshared, entirely their own, and the music, which had continued in the background, faltered again, not stopping, but slipping just enough for those listening closely to notice the hesitation in the strings, the brief uncertainty before the rhythm resumed. And Eliza became aware of the sound in a way she had not before, the distance between each note, the way it no longer matched the cadence of her own breath, and she adjusted her stance, a small shift of her foot against the marble, grounding herself, steadying the balance that had been disrupted not by movement, but by the absence of it. And the Duke's gaze followed that shift, not in a way that called attention to it, but in a way that acknowledged it, precise, contained, as though he were noting each adjustment she made and deciding, silently, whether to allow it. And that awareness settled into her, not as fear, not exactly, but as something colder, something more focused, because she understood now that nothing she did in this space would go unnoticed, not by him, not anymore. And her aunt's hand withdrew, slowly, carefully, the contact ending without acknowledgement, as though the withdrawal itself were a concession that could not be seen as one, and she stepped back, not far, just enough to reposition herself within the structure of the room, her expression unchanged, her posture perfect, but the distance between her and Eliza now marked by something that had not been there before, something that could not be smoothed over with a smile or a quiet word. And for a moment, no one moved, not fully, not decisively. The entire ballroom held in that narrow space between action and consequence. And then, from the far side of the room, a servant approached, drawn by the spill that had long since dried at the edges. His steps careful, measured, his eyes lowered as he reached for a cloth to clean what remained on the marble, and the movement, small and ordinary, cut through the stillness in a way nothing else had, because it was practical, because it belonged to the world as it should have been. And as he bent to wipe the floor, his shoulder brushed lightly against the edge of Eliza's skirt, just enough to shift the fabric, just enough to remind her of the physical space she occupied, and she reacted instinctively, her hand tightening on the tray, her body adjusting to the contact, and the tray tilted, not far, not enough to spill, but enough to break the perfect balance she had been holding. And the Duke's hand moved again, faster this time, not hurried, but immediate, steadying the tray before the motion could complete, his fingers closing briefly around the edge, his other hand lifting slightly as though to catch what had not yet fallen, and for a fraction of a second, the entire room froze around that movement. The servant pausing mid-motion, the cloth suspended above the marble, Lord Harrington's gaze sharpening, the line of young women near the center stilled in their careful arrangement. And Eliza felt it, the exact point where everything could have shifted into something irreversible, held back by a single, controlled action. And when the Duke released the tray once more, the silence that followed was heavier than before, not uncertain now, but expectant, as though the room had recognized that the next movement would not be an accident and would not be allowed to pass unnoticed. The silence did not break. It thickened, settling into the space like something that had chosen to remain, and Eliza felt it press against her ribs, not painful, not overwhelming, but constant, a reminder that the moment had not passed, that it had only deepened, and the tray in her hand seemed heavier now, not from its weight, but from what it carried, not glasses, not champagne, but attention, expectation, consequence. And she adjusted her stance again, a careful shift of her right foot, the sole of her shoe aligning against the seam in the marble, as if anchoring herself to something solid, might steady what had begun to move beyond her control. And the Duke's gaze followed that movement, not quickly, not sharply, but with the same measured precision he had given everything else, as though each adjustment she made was part of a pattern he was choosing to observe rather than interrupt. And across from them, Lord Harrington's posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, his shoulders straightening, his chin lifting by a fraction, the expression on his face smoothing into something more formal, more deliberate, as though he had decided that observation alone was no longer sufficient. And he stepped forward again, this time not angling himself to the side, but entering the line that had formed between Eliza and the Duke, not breaking it, but intersecting it just enough to alter its shape. And when he spoke, his voice carried further than before, not raised, but placed with intention. "It would seem," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to Eliza before returning to the Duke, "that the evening has taken an unexpected turn." And the words were light, almost conversational, but the room responded to them, because they acknowledged what no one else had yet dared to name. And Eliza felt the shift ripple outward, the line of young women, near the center adjusting again, their arrangement no longer symmetrical, no longer certain. One of them lowering her fan completely now, her attention fixed openly, no longer concealed, and her aunt did not move immediately, which in itself was a decision, because intervention had become risk, and risk required calculation, and Eliza could feel that calculation like a presence at her back, the absence of her aunt's hand now more noticeable than its touch had been. And for a moment, nothing changed, not visibly, not in a way that could be pointed to, but the tension continued to rise, quiet, controlled. And then the Duke moved, not toward Harrington, not away from him, but closer to Eliza, a single step that closed what little distance remained, his presence now undeniable, his proximity altering the space in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. And she felt it immediately, the shift in air, the faint warmth where his coat nearly touched her sleeve again, the awareness of his height, his stillness, his attention, and her breath caught, not sharply, not enough to draw notice, but enough that she became aware of it, aware of the way her chest rose and fell, aware of the way the tray in her hand remained steady despite everything inside her adjusting. And he did not reach for it this time, did not steady it, did not intervene in any visible way. He simply stood there, occupying the space she had once been allowed to leave. And when he spoke, it was quieter than before, lower, the words meant for her alone, though they carried just enough to be heard by those closest. "Look at me," he said. And it was not a command in the way his earlier words had been, not sharp, not cutting, but it carried something else, something that left no room for avoidance. And Eliza hesitated, not outwardly, not in a way that could be seen, but internally, the instinct to lower her gaze, to remain unseen, colliding with the weight of his attention. And for a fraction of a second, she remained exactly as she was, eyes lowered, breath held, and then she lifted her gaze, slowly, deliberately, the movement small but absolute. And when her eyes met his, the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not explosive, but precise, as though a line had been drawn and she had stepped across it without knowing where it would lead. And the room felt it, even if no one could name it, the shift from observation to involvement, from distance to proximity. And Lord Harrington's expression sharpened again, his gaze narrowing slightly as he watched the exchange, no longer casual, no longer detached. And he took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the Duke, positioning himself just within the edge of their space, his presence now part of the moment rather than its witness. And the balance shifted again, not breaking, but straining, as though the room itself were deciding how much it could hold before something gave way. And Eliza felt it, the pressure building, the awareness that every movement now carried consequence, that every breath, every shift of weight, every glance would be seen, measured, remembered. And she remained still, not because she had no choice, but because every choice had been narrowed to this, to standing, to holding, to meeting his gaze without looking away. And the music faltered again, just slightly, the violin missing a note before recovering, the sound stretching thin across the room. And in that brief imperfection, everything seemed to pause once more. The servant still crouched near the floor, the cloth unmoving in his hand. The women at the center frozen in their half-formed adjustments. Her aunt standing just beyond reach, her expression composed but her attention fixed. And in the middle of it all, Eliza Whitmore stood with a tray in her hands and a duke standing too close. And for the first time, it did not feel like she was the one out of place. It felt like the room itself had shifted around her, and no one had yet decided how to move it back. The moment did not release. It compressed, tightening around them until even the smallest movement felt deliberate, and Eliza became aware of everything at once. The faint scent of champagne still clinging to the air, the distant crackle of candlelight above, the subtle shift of silk as someone near the center adjusted their stance, and most of all, the steady, unwavering presence of the Duke standing close enough that the space between them no longer belonged to her alone, and she did not look away. Not now, not after he had asked, because something in his voice had removed that option without force, without insistence, simply by existing, and her eyes remained on his, steady in a way that surprised her, even as her pulse moved faster beneath the surface, controlled, contained, and around them. The room held its breath again, not fully still, but suspended in that fragile state where everything waited for the next decision to be made. And it was Lord Harrington who moved first, his hand lifting slightly, a measured gesture that drew just enough attention to him without demanding it, his fingers brushing the edge of his cuff as though adjusting it, though the movement was too deliberate to be casual, and he stepped forward once more, closing the distance completely now, placing himself within the narrow triangle of space that had formed between Eliza and the Duke, and the shift was immediate, the balance altered, the tension redirected, and when he spoke, his voice carried further than before, not louder, but firmer, shaped to reach beyond the immediate circle and into the awareness of the room. "Your Grace," he said, the title precise, controlled. "Surely this is not the place for improvisation." And the pause before the final word was slight, almost polite, but it carried weight, the kind that invited agreement without demanding it. And the room responded, subtly, almost imperceptibly, shoulders aligning, attention sharpening, as though the structure that had been disturbed might yet be restored. And Eliza felt it, the pull of that structure, the quiet pressure urging her to step back, to lower her gaze, to allow the moment to dissolve into something manageable, something that could be explained away and forgotten. And her fingers shifted on the tray, just slightly, the edge pressing into her palm, as if reminding her of the role she still held, the object that tethered her to the place she had always occupied. And for a fraction of a second, she almost moved, almost allowed the motion to complete, but the Duke did not step aside, did not create the space she would need to retreat. Instead, he adjusted his stance again, a small, controlled movement that aligned him more directly with her, not shielding, not claiming, but placing himself in a position that made her retreat impossible without acknowledgement, and the effect was immediate. The motion halted before it began, and the room felt it, the interruption of expectation, the quiet refusal to return to what had been, and Lord Harrington's gaze flickered, not missing the shift, his expression tightening just slightly at the corners, the first visible sign that the situation had moved beyond his control. And he took another step, this time closer to the Duke than to Eliza, his presence now fully engaged, no longer observational, and the air between them changed, not in hostility, not in open challenge, but in something more refined, more precise, the kind of tension that existed between men who understood power without needing to display it. And Eliza stood within that space, aware of both of them, aware of the line she occupied between their positions, and she adjusted her grip again, not to steady the tray this time, but to steady herself, her fingers tightening just enough to ground her in the moment, and the tray tilted, not enough to spill, but enough to shift the balance once more, and the movement, small as it was, drew attention again, the kind that could not be ignored now, not after everything that had already happened. And the Duke's hand moved, not to the tray this time, but to her wrist, a brief, controlled contact, his fingers closing lightly, just enough to still the motion, to bring the tilt back into alignment before it could complete, and the touch was immediate, precise, and the effect was absolute. The movement stopping not because it had been corrected, but because it had been acknowledged, and for a fraction of a second, everything froze around that contact. The servant still crouched, the cloth suspended mid-motion, the line of women at the center held in their careful arrangement. Lord Harrington's gaze sharpening as it fixed on the point where the Duke's hand rested against her skin, and Eliza felt it, not as pressure, not as restraint, but as certainty, the kind that did not need to explain itself. And then he released her, just as quickly, his hand withdrawing as though the contact had been nothing more than a practical correction. And yet the space it left behind did not close. It remained marked, defined by what had just been seen, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, no longer uncertain, no longer tentative, but charged, as though the room had reached the edge of something and had not yet decided whether to step forward or pull back. And Eliza remained exactly where she was, her wrist still, her hand steady on the tray, her gaze still lifted, and for the first time, the weight pressing against her did not feel like something she needed to escape. It felt like something she was being asked to endure, and around her, the room waited, every movement delayed, every breath measured, as though the next second would determine not only what happened next, but what would be remembered long after the music resumed. The contact did not linger, but its absence did, a faint echo against her wrist that refused to fade as the room held itself at the edge of something it could no longer pretend not to see. And Eliza stood there, the tray steady in her hands, her posture unchanged, though everything around her had shifted into a configuration that no longer followed the rules she had been taught to obey. And across from her, Lord Harrington's gaze did not move, fixed now on the place where the Duke had touched her, as if the moment could be undone by examining it closely enough. And then he smiled, not warmly, not with ease, but with a precision that suggested decision, and he stepped forward, closing the last fraction of distance between himself and the Duke, his presence no longer adjacent but directly engaged, his voice low but clear, shaped to reach only those who mattered. "You place a great deal of importance," he said, each word measured, "on what others might overlook." And the implications settled into the space between them, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. And the room responded, not with sound, but with alignment, bodies angling, attention tightening, the line of young women near the center no longer pretending disinterest, their stillness now deliberate, expectant. And Eliza felt the weight of it all converge, the awareness that she had become the point around which something larger was now turning, not by choice, not by merit, but by the quiet insistence of a man who had decided not to let her disappear. And her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the tray, the pressure grounding her, anchoring her to the moment even as everything else seemed to shift beyond recognition. And she drew a breath, slow, controlled, aware of the way it moved through her chest, aware of the way it steadied her, without softening the tension that had begun to build. And the Duke did not respond immediately, not to Harrington, not to the room, his gaze remaining on her for a fraction of a second longer, as though completing a thought that had not yet been spoken. And then he turned, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the presence that had stepped into his line, his expression unchanged, composed, his voice, when it came, quiet and exact. "I do not overlook," he said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any elaboration could have, because it did not explain, it did not justify, it simply defined, and the effect was immediate, not in sound, but in stillness, the room absorbing the words, recalibrating around them. And Lord Harrington's smile did not falter, but it sharpened, the corners tightening just enough to reveal the shift beneath it, and he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that did not concede. "Then you must also recognize," he continued, his tone unchanged, "that not everything presented is meant to be reconsidered." And the pause lingered, not long, but long enough for the room to understand what had been suggested, what had been challenged. And Eliza felt it, the pressure rising, the invisible lines of expectation pulling in opposite directions, and her foot shifted again, the smallest movement, the instinct to retreat returning with a clarity that was almost physical. And this time, she began to follow it, her heel lifting from the marble, her body angling just slightly away, the tray tilting with her as the balance shifted. And for a fraction of a second, It seemed as though the moment might resolve itself through that simple motion, that she might step back into the place she had always occupied, that the room might close around the space she left behind and continue as though nothing had happened. But the Duke moved at the same time, not reaching for her wrist this time, not intercepting the tray, but stepping directly into her path, his movement precise, controlled, the distance between them closing completely so that there was no space left for her to step into without meeting him. And her motion stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, but absolutely, held in place by the impossibility of continuing without acknowledgement, and the tray steadied again, the tilt corrected not by his hand, but by her own, as though the act of being stopped had forced her to regain control, and the room froze. Around them, not in surprise now, but in recognition, because this was no longer accidental, no longer a series of small corrections. It was a decision, visible, undeniable, and Lord Harrington's expression shifted again, this time without concealment, the interest replaced by something sharper, something that suggested the line had been crossed and could not be redrawn, and he took one final step, closing the distance between himself and the Duke until they stood nearly shoulder to shoulder, the space between them charged with a tension that did not need to be named, and Eliza stood within that narrow triangle, her breath steady, her hands still, her gaze no longer lowered, and for the first time, she felt the shift not as pressure, but as something else, something colder, something more defined, because the choice had been taken from her, but the position had not, and she remained exactly where she was, not stepping back, not yielding, not disappearing, and the room responded, the silence deepening, the air tightening, as though everything had drawn inward to witness what would come next, and then, without raising his voice, without turning fully away from her, the Duke spoke again, the words directed not to Harrington, not to the room, but to her, precise, unyielding. "Stand," he said, and it was not a request, not an instruction she could interpret, it was a placement, a final alignment that left no room for retreat, and Eliza Whitmore did not move, not because she could not, but because for the first time, she understood that moving would no longer return her to where she had been, and the moment held, suspended at its highest point, every eye fixed, every breath measured, as the room waited for the consequence of a decision that had already been made. The word did not fade, it settled, locking into place with a finality that the room could not ignore, and Eliza felt it move through her like something solid, not a suggestion, not a passing instruction, but a decision that had already been made, and she remained exactly where she was, her posture steady, her hands still on the tray, her gaze no longer lowered, and for a moment, nothing changed, not visibly, not immediately, but the silence deepened, the kind that comes when a room understands. It has crossed a line and cannot return to what it was before, and then her aunt stepped forward, not slowly this time, not cautiously, but with a precision that carried urgency beneath its control, her hand reaching again, this time not hovering, not guiding, but taking hold of Eliza's arm with a firmness that could no longer be mistaken for subtle correction, and her voice, though still measured, carried a sharper edge. "This has gone far enough," she said, each word placed carefully, but no longer soft, no longer willing to wait. "Release her." And the command was directed at the Duke, not at Eliza, not at the room, and that alone shifted something, because it acknowledged what had already been seen, what had already been understood, that Eliza was no longer simply standing there. She was being held in place by a force that did not belong to her, and the room responded, not with sound, but with attention tightening, every gaze drawn to the point where her aunt's hand rested against her arm, where the Duke stood too close, where the space between authority and defiance had narrowed to almost nothing, and for a fraction of a second, it seemed as though the balance might break, that the moment might fracture under the pressure of competing claims, but the Duke did not step back, did not remove himself, did not acknowledge the command in the way it had been given. Instead he moved, not away from Eliza, but closer, his hand lifting once more, not to her wrist this time, but to the tray, his fingers closing around it with a controlled, deliberate motion, and before she could react, before the room could fully register the shift, he took it from her, the silver leaving her hands in a single, fluid movement, the weight gone, The object that had defined her role removed without hesitation, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because without the tray, there was nothing left to justify her presence as it had been, nothing left to frame her as servant, as support, as background, and her hands, suddenly empty, hovered for a fraction of a second, before lowering to her sides, the absence of weight more disorienting than its presence had ever been. And the Duke did not pass the tray to a servant, did not set it aside. He held it, just long enough for the room to see, for the meaning to settle, and then, without looking away from her, he extended it slightly, just enough for the nearest attendant to step forward and take it from him. The exchange quick, efficient, almost invisible, but the impact lingered, because the act had not been about the tray, it had been about removing what defined her place, and leaving her standing there without it, and the room felt it, the shift, the subtle but undeniable change in how she was seen, not fully, not yet, but enough to disrupt the structure that had held her at the edges, and her aunt's hand tightened, just briefly, before releasing, the motion controlled, deliberate, as though she had recognized that holding on would now draw more attention than letting go, and when she spoke again, her voice was sharper, the polish slipping just enough to reveal the urgency beneath it. "She is not presented," she said, each word clear, precise, meant to restore order, to define boundaries that had been crossed. "She has no standing here." And the statement carried weight, the kind that had always been enough to end any discussion, to return everything to its proper place. And the room responded, a murmur beginning to form, the quiet agreement of a structure reasserting itself. And Eliza felt it, the pull of it, the familiar force that had shaped her life, that had kept her small, contained, manageable, and for a moment, it seemed as though it might work, that the absence of the tray would not matter, that the definition would hold. But the Duke spoke, and the sound of his voice cut cleanly through the rising murmur, not loud, not forceful, but precise enough to stop it before it could take shape. "She stands," he said, and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried something more, something that did not argue, did not justify, did not explain, but redefined, and the room stilled again, the murmur dissolving before it could become anything more, and her aunt's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, the certainty in it faltering for the first time, and she took a step back, not fully, not retreating, but adjusting, recalculating, and Lord Harrington's gaze moved between them, sharper now, more focused, as though he were witnessing something he had not anticipated, something that had moved beyond the bounds of expectation, and Eliza stood there, her hands empty, her posture unchanged, but everything about her position altered, because she was no longer holding anything that justified her presence, no longer carrying a role that explained her place. She was simply there, and the Duke remained beside her, not touching her, not holding her, but placing himself in alignment with her in a way that could not be dismissed, and the space around them shifted, not visibly, but undeniably, as though the room itself had recognized that something had changed at its center, something that could not be undone by a single word or a practiced smile. And for the first time, Eliza felt it not as pressure, not as weight, but as something else, something sharper, something that cut through the years of being overlooked, something that demanded to be acknowledged. And she did not move, not because she was told to, but because there was nowhere left to move that would return her to who she had been. And the room held, suspended at the edge of understanding, as the realization began to settle that the girl who had entered unnoticed could no longer be placed back where she had been. The words did not echo, yet they rewrote the room, settling into the air with a quiet authority that no one could mistake. And Eliza felt it before she understood it. The shift not around her, but through her, as if something that had always been fixed had suddenly been moved without warning. And for a moment, no one spoke, not her aunt, not Lord Harrington, not even the women at the center who had spent the evening being observed and measured, because the statement had not invited response, it had replaced it. And Eliza stood there with nothing in her hands, no object to justify her presence, no task to anchor her place, only herself. And the awareness of that was almost disorienting, because she had never been required to occupy a space without purpose before, and now she did, fully visible, fully acknowledged, and beside her, the Duke remained exactly where he had positioned himself, not touching her, not guiding her, but aligned with her in a way that altered the meaning of her presence entirely. And her aunt recovered first, not with hesitation, but with a sharp, controlled inhale that seemed to pull the room back toward structure, her posture straightening, her expression smoothing into something colder, more deliberate. "You misunderstand," she said, her voice precise, each word placed carefully, as though rebuilding something that had been broken. "She stands because she does not yet know her place." And the statement landed with weight, the kind that had always been enough to correct, to diminish, to return things to order, and Eliza felt it, the old gravity of it, the familiar pull toward silence, toward retreat, toward becoming smaller again, and her fingers curled slightly at her sides, the instinct to fold inward returning with a clarity that was almost physical, and for a fraction of a second, she wavered, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, the line between what she had always been and what she was being forced to become narrowing to something fragile. And then the Duke moved, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a precision that cut through that hesitation before it could take hold, his hand lifting, not to her wrist, not to her arm, but to her chin, a brief, controlled contact, his fingers resting lightly, just enough to guide, just enough to tilt her gaze upward when it began to lower, and the motion was immediate, subtle, but absolute, her head lifting, her eyes no longer allowed to drop, and the room froze around that gesture, not in surprise, not anymore, but in recognition, because this was no longer a correction, no longer a quiet intervention. It was a declaration, visible, undeniable, and the contact lasted only a second, no more, his hand withdrawing as soon as the motion was complete. But the effect remained, her posture altered, her gaze fixed forward, her position no longer ambiguous, and her aunt's expression tightened, just slightly, the control in it cracking at the edges, because this was no longer something that could be dismissed, no longer something that could be quietly corrected without consequence. And Lord Harrington's attention sharpened again, his stance shifting, his weight settling into something more deliberate, as though he had recognized that the moment had moved beyond subtlety and into something that would define the evening itself. And he spoke, his voice carrying further now, no longer confined to the immediate circle. "You would elevate her," he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a statement that demanded acknowledgement, and the room responded, the tension tightening, the silence deepening, because the words had named what had only been implied before, and Eliza felt it, the full weight of it settling around her, the realization that this was no longer about a single moment, no longer about a single decision. It was about what she represented now, what she had been made to represent without her consent, and the Duke did not hesitate, did not soften, did not redirect, his gaze steady, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I recognize her," he said, and the difference between the words was immediate, because elevation could be contested, could be argued, could be denied, but recognition could not. It did not depend on agreement. It did not require permission. It simply existed, and the room absorbed that distinction, the implications settling in a way that could not be undone, and her aunt stepped forward again, this time without restraint, her composure tightening into something sharper, more urgent. "She has no name that matters here," she said, the words cutting, precise, meant to restore the hierarchy that had been disrupted, and Eliza felt it, the familiar sting of it, the truth that had defined her for as long as she could remember, the way her existence had always been measured against what it lacked, and for a moment, it pressed against her, threatening to pull her back into that smaller shape, that quieter version of herself that had never been meant to stand in the center of anything. And then, the Duke spoke again, and the effect was immediate, the pressure breaking before it could settle. "She has mine," he said, and the room did not move, did not breathe, did not shift, because the words did not simply counter her aunt's claim. They replaced it, they rewrote it entirely, and Eliza felt it, the impact of it moving through her with a clarity that left no room for doubt, not about what it meant, not about what had just been declared, and her breath caught, not sharply, not enough to draw attention, but enough that she became aware of it, aware of the way everything inside her had shifted in response. and the room responded. Not with sound, not immediately, but with stillness, the kind that comes when something irreversible has been said. And Lord Harrington's expression changed, not concealed now, not controlled, but openly sharp, his gaze fixed on the Duke, measuring, calculating, and for the first time, stepping back, not retreating, but adjusting, as though recognizing that the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could not immediately counter. And Eliza stood there, her hands empty, her posture altered, her gaze lifted, and for the first time in her life, the space she occupied did not feel borrowed. It did not feel conditional. It felt claimed, and the weight of that settled into her with a force that was both unfamiliar and undeniable. And she did not move, not because she was told to, not because she was held in place, but because moving would now mean stepping away from something she could no longer pretend did not exist. And around her, the room held, suspended in the aftermath of a declaration that had changed everything, as every person present tried to understand what it would mean when the music finally resumed. The words did not dissolve. They settled into the room like something permanent, reshaping the space in a way that could not be undone. And Eliza felt it in the way the air shifted around her, no longer pressing her back toward the edges, no longer guiding her toward invisibility, but holding her exactly where she stood. And for a moment, no one moved. Not her aunt, not Lord Harrington, not the carefully arranged line of women whose presence had defined the evening before everything changed. Because the declaration had not asked for agreement, it had replaced it, and Eliza became aware of her hands again, empty, unoccupied, no longer defined by service or purpose, and she lifted them slightly, almost unconsciously, as though confirming that the weight she had carried was truly gone, her fingers curling and uncurling once before settling at her sides, and the motion, small as it was, drew attention because it belonged to her alone, not to a role, not to an expectation, and the Duke watched it, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with a steady awareness that did not waver. And then he moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with that same precise control that had defined every action he had taken since entering the room, his hand extending toward her, not taking, not commanding, but offering. The gesture simple, almost understated, and yet it carried more weight than anything else that had happened, because it required her to respond, not as something placed, not as something directed, but as someone choosing. And Eliza hesitated, not long, not visibly, but enough for the moment to register, enough for the room to hold its breath again. And she looked at his hand, then at his face, the distance between the two no longer abstract, no longer impossible. And then she placed her hand in his, the contact light, controlled, but certain, and the effect was immediate, not in sound, not in movement, but in alignment, because the moment her hand met his, the room recalibrated around that single point, the unspoken structure shifting to accommodate what had just been made visible, and her aunt stepped back, not by choice, not willingly, but because there was no longer space to stand where she had been, her expression composed but no longer certain. And Lord Harrington did not move forward again, did not interrupt, his stance adjusting instead, his attention fixed, measuring, as though calculating the cost of what had just been set into motion, and the line of women at the center no longer held its shape. The symmetry broken beyond repair, their attention no longer directed outward but inward, toward the place where the evening had been rewritten, and the music, which had faltered so many times before, began again, not abruptly, not as a command, but as a quiet return, the strings finding their rhythm, the notes settling into place as though the room itself had decided to continue despite the shift. And Eliza felt it, the movement of it beneath her feet, the subtle vibration of sound against marble, the way the world resumed without undoing what had happened. And the Duke's hand did not tighten around hers, did not guide her immediately. He simply held it, steady, present, allowing the moment to exist before shaping it further. And when he finally moved, it was not toward the center, not toward the place where the others had stood, but forward, across the space that had once separated her from everything she had not been allowed to touch. And she followed, not because she was pulled, not because she was led, but because the path had been made visible and she could no longer pretend not to see it. And each step was deliberate, measured, The sound of their movement quiet but unmistakable against the marble, and the room parted, not dramatically, not with spectacle, but with a controlled adjustment that acknowledged what had already been accepted, and Eliza felt it, the space opening before her, not as something granted, but as something recognized. And when they reached the center, the place where she had never stood, the Duke stopped, not releasing her hand, not stepping away, but holding that position as though anchoring it into the memory of the room. And for a moment, nothing else happened. No words, no gestures, just the stillness of two figures standing where only one had been expected. And then the music shifted again, the tempo adjusting, the rhythm deepening, and the Duke turned slightly, his hand still holding hers, his other hand lifting just enough to mark the beginning of something that had not been planned. And Eliza understood, not through instruction, not through explanation, but through the quiet certainty of the moment itself, and she moved with him. The first step small, controlled, her body adjusting to the unfamiliar pattern, the unfamiliar space, and the room watched, not with laughter, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition, because the balance had changed, the structure had been rewritten, and though the tension had not disappeared, though the consequences had not yet been revealed, the shift itself had already taken place. And as they moved, slow, deliberate, the echoes of what had been said lingered in every corner of the ballroom, shaping every glance, every breath, every unspoken thought. And Eliza Whitmore, who had entered unseen, now stood where she could no longer be overlooked, her hand in the Duke's, her place no longer defined by what she lacked, but by what had been, claimed in front of everyone. And the room, though it continued, would not forget the moment it had changed. The movement did not feel like a performance. It felt like a shift in gravity, subtle but undeniable, and Eliza followed it step by step, her hand still in his, her posture no longer shaped by avoidance, but by something steadier, something that did not ask permission to exist. And the music wrapped around them, not guiding, not dictating, but framing what had already been decided. And for a moment, the world narrowed to the measured rhythm beneath her feet, the quiet certainty of his hand holding hers, the awareness that every eye in the room remained fixed on them, not with dismissal, not with quiet amusement, but with attention that could no longer be withdrawn. And she felt it, not as pressure now, but as presence, something that acknowledged her rather than reduced her. And the Duke did not rush the movement, did not turn it into spectacle, each step deliberate, controlled, as though the purpose was not to display, but to define. And when he turned her, the motion was smooth, precise, her skirt shifting lightly against the marble as the space around them adjusted. And for a fraction of a second, everything aligned, the sound, the movement, the stillness beyond it. And the room seemed to pause again, not in tension this time, but in recognition. And Eliza became aware of herself in a way she had never been before, not as something observed, not as something measured against others, but as something that simply existed within the space without apology. And the realization settled quietly, without force, but with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And when the music began to soften, not ending, but drawing toward a close, the Duke did not release her immediately. He held the final position for a moment longer, his hand still steady, his presence unchanged, as though anchoring the moment into something that would remain even after it passed. And then, slowly, he let go, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with a control that made the absence of contact as deliberate as its presence had been. And her hand lowered, not uncertain, not searching, simply returning to her side. And the space between them remained, not empty, but defined. And the room exhaled, not all at once, but in fragments, the tension easing into something quieter, something more measured. And movement began again at the edges, conversations resuming, the structure attempting to rebuild itself around what had happened. But it did not return to what it had been, not fully, not completely, because the shift had already taken place and could not be undone. And Eliza stood there, no longer holding anything, no longer standing at the edge, but at the center of a moment that had already altered the way she would be seen. And she did not step back, not immediately, because there was no instinct left to follow, no path that led to the version of herself that had entered the room unnoticed. And across from her, Lord Harrington inclined his head, a gesture that acknowledged more than courtesy now. His expression composed but no longer dismissive, and her aunt remained. Still, her posture perfect, her silence more revealing than any words she might have chosen, and the Duke turned slightly, not away from Eliza, but toward the room, his gaze moving across the space with the same quiet authority that had shaped everything since his arrival. And then he stepped back, a single, measured movement that created distance without removing presence. And in that space, Eliza felt it. The final shift settling into place, because she was no longer being held there, no longer positioned by his proximity. She remained because she chose to remain, and the realization did not arrive with force. It arrived with certainty, quiet, steady, and complete, and she lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of what had changed, and the room saw it, the subtle adjustment, the final alignment, and accepted it in the only way it could, by not contesting it further. And the music faded into its final note, the sound lingering just long enough to mark the end of something that had not been planned. And as the last vibration settled into silence, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened once more, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled precision as before, and a servant stepped inside, pausing just long enough to be noticed, his posture formal, his voice low but clear as he announced the arrival of a name that had not yet entered the evening. And the effect was immediate, not in movement, but in awareness, because whatever had just been claimed, whatever had just been set into place, had not yet been tested, and Eliza felt it. The faint return of tension at the edges, the reminder that recognition was not the end, but the beginning of something that would require more than a single moment to hold.